People always talk about Canada's approach to gun control and confiscation as a violation of our property rights. But I think the real issue is much more problematic than that. Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be drawing a bit of a line in the sand. I want to discuss the difference between firearm regulation and gun control. Now I know that may sound like I'm splitting hairs here, or perhaps you think there's not really much difference between the two, but I do think that this is actually an important distinction to be made. Some of what I'm going to say here runs the risk of pissing off a lot of people at first, but this is designed to be something of a holistic argument, so if you write me off in the first minute or two of the video, you're probably going to end up missing the punchline, so please stick around. So let's get into it. We always say that gun control is it's not about public safety. And honestly, that is correct, but I don't think we really explain it properly. Like, we always end up providing some statistics or some evidence to demonstrate that we are not a threat or a risk of any kind to public safety, but that never ends up being enough. Because what's always the response from the gun control types? They always say, yeah, well, why do you need a gun? Why do you need an AR-15? So on and so forth. And that, by its very nature, that is no longer a public safety question. That's a tolerance question. Because when they ask that question, they're no longer wondering whether firearms pose some kind of particular danger. What they're asking is why they should be required to tolerate any danger that firearms may pose. Like, if public safety is the question, then perhaps there is actually some room to talk about some reasonable concessions on our freedom in order to meet that goal. Concessions like, a licensing system to promote training and background checks for criminal or mental health issues. Like, these make some degree of sense, and there is even some evidence to suggest that these kind of measures can be effective at improving public safety. And the reason that measures like this work is because the only people who are prevented from owning and using firearms in an environment like this are the ones who probably shouldn't own firearms anyway. It's aimed directly at preventing misuse while purposefully allowing legitimate use. That's firearm regulation. Now, you don't have to like firearm regulation, but at least it's something approaching a reasoned response, and it's something which is consistent with the fact that nearly everything else in our society is regulated in a similar fashion. Now, you could certainly argue against the mass regulation of our entire society, and I think there are definitely some solid points to be made on that one, but these are problems which are not unique to firearms ownership. So given the near universal regulation of our society, it would be weird and frankly pretty unrealistic to expect firearms to be given some kind of special carve-out from an otherwise universal regime. Now, gun control, however, is a different beast entirely. It's based on the idea that we can't 100% absolutely guarantee that nobody anywhere ever will misbehave. Therefore, we need to ban even the legitimate use of guns in order to ensure that no firearm anywhere can ever be misused. And in effect, what this means is that the gun control types don't even believe that there is such a thing as a legitimate use of firearms. All firearms pose a risk, and therefore the only solution is to ban them all. Like, the backbone of the argument here is not that licensed firearm owners pose some kind of legitimate threat to public safety. The argument is that licensed firearms owners hold no value to society, and therefore it's no great loss to criminalize them all if it means even saving one life. It's not that we're considered a public safety risk, it's that we're considered undesirables. And that is a much, much worse problem. And this is why we never make any progress on the gun control front. It's not an argument we can win with statistics and facts because they are just fundamentally not talking about statistics and facts. And I mean, honestly, the statistics and facts are essentially irrelevant. All they're saying is that there is a risk, but unlike the risks associated with the freedoms that is guaranteed to everyone else in Canada, our freedom is a risk that they feel they are not required to tolerate. Because as crazy as it sounds, the government and the gun control types are already saying this. Like, they already agree with that. They already agree that we are not a public safety threat. They know, and they have said this on many occasions, that the overwhelming vast majority of gun owners don't pose a risk to public safety. They have said that numerous times.
We recognize that the vast majority of gun owners use them safely and in accordance with the law.
The overwhelming majority of firearm owners in this country are law-abiding. They are responsible firearm owners. They acquire their firearms legally. They store them securely. They use them responsibly.
What they always say instead is that one person hurt by gun violence is too many. So all they're essentially measuring here is population size. Once a certain number of gun owners end up in Canada, it is inevitable, even if it's a 1 in a million chance, it is inevitable that at some point one gun is going to hurt someone. Therefore, no one should have any guns. That's their argument. That's the basis of what they're saying. Even though they completely understand that, by and large, we're completely harmless. And Trudeau even said this point blank on May 1st, 2020 at the outset of the firearm prohibitions. Like, he said straight up, licensed gun owners aren't the issue.
And the vast majority of gun owners use them safely, responsibly, and in accordance with the law.
But we are under no obligation to tolerate you anyway.
But you don't need an AR-15 to bring down a deer.
Now, you might try to argue that what he's saying here is that licensed gun owners are not the danger, it's just that some guns are the danger. But that's really not true at all. Because at the end of the day, the government isn't promising to throw our guns in prison, it's promising to throw gun owners in prison. And more than just what the government and the gun control types would say about us, it's even established by law that licensed gun owners are not a public safety threat. Section 5 of the Firearms Act pertains to license eligibility, and it is crystal clear. People are ineligible to hold a firearms license if it is in the interest of the safety of that or any other person, or if we pose a risk of harm to any person. So simply by virtue of being a licensed gun owner, the RCMP through the Canadian Firearms Program has already declared us to not be a public safety risk. Otherwise, we couldn't hold our licenses. And then on top of that, you also have 9 of the 13 provinces and territories, as well as dozens of individual municipalities and police agencies also standing up and saying that they will not participate in the confiscation program because the program is not going to help public safety. Like, if you ask these parties if they support the regulation of firearms through licensing, training, and background checks and so on, none of them would oppose that, not a single one of them, because those are sensible public safety measures. But if you ask them if they support gun control through the confiscation and mass imprisonment of innocent Canadians who present no threat to public safety, suddenly you get almost universal opposition. And that's because gun control isn't rooted in public safety. It's rooted in intolerance. And for anyone who doesn't treat law-abiding gun owners like second-class citizens, gun control in the name of public safety quite simply doesn't make any sense. The math doesn't add up. It doesn't check out. Now, the gun control types try to get away from this by claiming that the majority of Canadian citizens want this, and this even came up as evidence in the CCFR's court case with Injustice Kane. One of the government's experts, Professor Blake Brown, cited a pair of polls with stacked questions putting support for gun control in Canada around 80% in 2020. However, if you go back 25 years to 1995, before the introduction of the Firearms Act, a curious thing happens. You find the same number. In 1995, 80% of Canadians and 91% of Quebecers wanted more gun control. Now, you could maybe challenge the validity of these numbers or suggest that they're cherry-picked results or whatever else, but even if they're not, it still tells us one very interesting and incredibly important thing. What this tells us is that even after adding all of the licensing, background checks, training courses, registration, storage laws, transport laws, banning most of the handguns and all of the assault-type military weapons, curious they said that, even after doing all of that, that had zero impact on public opinion. 80% of Canadians still wanted more gun control because more gun control is a default answer for 80% of the population. It's not a metric that measures public safety, it's a metric that measures intolerance. There is no such thing as enough gun control for 80% of Canadians. But even if it is true that the majority of Canadians want this, should that alone be enough? Because after all, we live in a democracy. And if the Democratic majority wants this, then so be it, right? It stands to reason. But that's not exactly true. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, even as little as it's worth, says that we are to live in a society that is both free and democratic, not just democratic. And a lot of people tend to forget this, but democracy isn't freedom, and freedom isn't democracy. They are not the same concept. In fact, if democracies and the democratic majorities were always virtuous and just, then there would be no reason to even have a list of rights and freedoms in the first place, because democracy would never be wrong and could never be wrong. It is self-evident that this is a flawed argument. And risk is the very nature of freedom. So long as people are free, they're also free to misbehave. Now, the gun control types find this risk to be intolerable, and so they aim to strip us of that freedom so that misbehavior is also impossible, or at least that's the promise that they make. However, in doing so, we're also stripped of the freedom to pursue legitimate behaviors as well. And this is a growing problem in Canada, which goes far beyond just gun control, but it is something that is especially visible for our community. Christine Van Gen, who is the litigation director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, she's done a number of videos on YouTube on this issue over the past couple of years, but it's a growing problem that she calls safetyism. The idea of safetyism is that safety is the most important thing, and it doesn't matter what other rights or freedoms are trampled on or stolen from people, so long as it's done to promote safety, however slight.
There's just zero connection between walking in the woods and preventing wildfires. Walking does not cause wildfires. And to make some deduction that when people walk, they might also do something else that causes a fire is just too much of a stretch. It's like saying people can't drive their cars because they might run people down on the sidewalk, or people can't walk on the sidewalk because they might punch someone in the face. You can ban the dangerous activity or the illegal activity without preventing the zero risk activity. Anything else is irrational, and it's couched in this terrible ideology of safetyism where no risk is acceptable. Safetyism is a mentality where risk becomes an excuse for control. It's a belief that safety, especially protection from physical or even emotional or mental harm, should be prioritized above all else, even at the cost of other fundamental values like freedom or autonomy or open debate.
Now, the zero risk activity, as she calls it, would be things like, hunting, sport shooting, and collecting. All of the normal, completely legitimate reasons for having a firearm. Like, you really can't make the argument that these things are a risk to public safety, especially not with our licensing system to back them up. I've demonstrated this many times before on the channel, as have so many other people, and so many studies and so much evidence out there supports this claim. But safetyism, rather ironically, isn't concerned with safety at all. It's rooted, once again, in intolerance. Because you can think about it like this. Are the only freedoms that we're allowed to have are those which pose absolutely zero possible risk? Because there is no such thing as a freedom which poses zero risk. Freedom itself is the risk. So long as people are free, they're also free to misbehave. And that's a feature of freedom. That's not a bug. That's what freedom is supposed to do. And that's usually what we're trying to explain when we compare the harm caused by firearms in relation to other things like driving. The harm caused by lawful firearm ownership is dramatically less than the harm that's caused by driving. Far more people are hurt and killed by cars every single year than firearms, and it's not even close. Yet the gun control types would say that these are not the same thing. Guns are evil and scary, while cars are very useful. And again, that's the voice of intolerance ringing through. And you don't have to take just my word for it. Here's Neil deGrasse Tyson explaining this very thing, even though he doesn't know it.
When they invented cars, and cars were killing people in the street because people didn't know how to cross the street. They didn't know where to cross the street. People don't know how to stop the cars. They say, well, cars are actually a pretty useful thing. Do we ban cars? No, we make stoplights. Oh, people are crossing. Well, we make crosswalks. Oh, let's put lanes so that cars don't hit each other. And let's make airbags so that you don't fly through the windshield. All right, so there are ways around problems if you value the thing that it is that you want to do.
So in principle, regulatory schemes like the licensing and registration for firearms owners are the sort of compromise that Neil deGrasse Tyson would be talking about. Unfortunately, in practice, these schemes are very difficult for us to get on board with because regulatory measures like these inevitably end up functioning more like a forward operating base from which the government can launch assaults on our community. And this happens not because we represent some sort of disproportionate danger to society. This happens because we are perceived as not having any value to society. And that is intolerance manifest. So when the government and the gun control types state over and over that one person killed by gun violence is just too many, their statement is not at all grounded in a concern for public safety. If one incident of harm is all of the evidence they need to persecute an entire community full of innocent and peaceful people, that's just prejudice, plain and simple. And worse than just the government and the gun control types saying it, this wording even found its way into Justice Kane's ruling in the CCFR's court case. One is too many has sort of become the mantra for the gun control types. It's rooted in ideology, it's rooted in intolerance, and it's the kind of intolerance which free societies are not supposed to engage in. Because if you apply that same reasoning to any other group of people, we all know it to be inherently unjustified, even at a glance. We would condemn anyone who says, Islam is a violent religion because of the existence of jihadists, therefore, Islam should be banned. We would condemn anyone who says, Catholic priests have a propensity for doing bad things to little boys, therefore Catholicism or Christianity should be banned. We would also condemn anyone who says, most crime is committed by insert minority group here, therefore everyone in that minority group should have less freedom because of the risk that they pose to society. We would condemn all of this because it's just garbage. Like, we all know those things to be wrong and demonstrably unjust. Intrinsically and inherently, it's beyond dispute. Free societies simply do not engage in that kind of discriminatory behavior. Yet that kind of unjustifiable discrimination somehow gets rebranded as common sense gun control when it's directed at us. So when people say that gun control and confiscation are a violation of our rights or even just our property rights, you're not wrong, not in the slightest, but that's not really the core of the problem here. The problem is that we're not being treated as free peoples. Instead, our community is being treated as undesirables, which need to be expunged. And this is way more dire than simply, property rights. Because before we can even get into a discussion about property rights, Canadians will need to believe that we are deserving of them in the first place, and that's just not the case at the moment. Canada has a pretty strong contempt for us, but worse than that, they're using this contempt to promote our mass criminalization. So, what can we do about it? Well, this kind of discrimination lands pretty squarely in the realm of hate speech. Probably not as it relates directly to sections 318 or 319 of the Criminal Code, but more so in the Supreme Court precedent of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission versus Whatcott. It probably wouldn't work under the Criminal Code because the statutes are a little bit narrower than the precedent is, but the precedent was given by the Supreme Court based on constitutional concerns, and the Constitution is the supreme law in Canada. So when you read Whatcott, there is a staggering amount of overlap between what it says would be hate speech and what the government has said about us and is what it is doing to us. And if you go further and look at the hallmarks of hatred, which are spelled out in the case of Warman versus Kouba, it reads less like the rules for hatred and more like the Liberal Party playbook on gun control. So this could give us an additional legal avenue to leverage at the Supreme Court if the CCFR's case gets that far, and I'll certainly be making a video explaining this in more detail in the near future. So get subscribed and stay tuned if you want to hear all about it. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.